Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Xoogler community meetup featuring Kirk Perry. So glad everyone could join us live over here, but also for those watching later. I'm so glad we were able to have one of Google's best loved executives join us today. I'll do a quick introduction and we'll just do a fireside chat from here. So Kirk now is the president and CEO of Circana, and he has worked both at Google, but also spent 30 years in CPG over at Procter Gamble, where he started his career. What I loved about his background was how much he gives back to his community. He's coached over a dozen sports teams. He's got 4 kids. He has a lovely wife. They're very involved in the community in Cincinnati, but also their church. And what I wanted to focus today's fireside chat on is both his background of how he got to where he is today, how he gives back, the jobs landscape, careers, but also leadership, because I think that was what he was particularly known for. When I didn't have the chance to work with Kirk when I was at Google, but I heard quite a few great stories about how he handled the situation in Orlando, which may get him to actually explain that it was a tough moment for everyone. But I think the way Kirk actually led the team there was pretty amazing. So, Kirk, why don't I turn over to you to do a quick intro yourself? If I didn't cover anything you want to make sure we kick things off with.
Wow, that was a great intro. I'll give you another hour to stop talking. No, it's great. I appreciate the ask. It's an honor to be with you. It's good to see some familiar faces, or at least names on here. I've just had a very blessed career to work at Procter, Google, and now Circana, and just happy to share some thoughts with you today.
Great, great. So one of the stories I read was how you were one of the major executives at Procter and Gamble, and as a result, the board member Scott Cook actually led perhaps yourself and a couple of team members through to Silicon Valley. And could you share about that story and perhaps also more about how you ended up at Google from that?
Sure. So it's a really long story. I'll make it really short, but the company told me I was on the short list for CEO succession candidates and assigned a board sponsor. At the time, I was the president of their global paper business. And Scott Cook happened to be my sponsor. And Intuit, the company he co-founded, was right down the street from us in Mountain View. Well, future us, but at the time, right down the street from Google. And so he said, hey, why don't you come out to the Valley, bring your leadership team. We'll spend a day at Intuit. We'll spend a day with the venture world in the Valley. And then on the last day, maybe a couple of your big digital partners like Facebook and Google. So Google happened to be the last company I met with on that last day. And my leadership team was meeting with, at the time, Leanne Hornsey, if you guys remember Leanne, who was the GBO HR leader for the company at the time. And somebody had asked a question about hiring and how do you hire people and how do you find the people you do at Google. And I remember distinctly, it was like she looked at me and I thought, wow, because she said, well, we've had this really senior job open for the last 18 months. We haven't found the right person. And she looked at me and I thought, huh, that was kind of weird. And I joked that I had a delusion of grandeur at the moment. Like, she doesn't know who I am. Why would she look at me? It doesn't matter. And so it'd go on. And I was thinking about it. And I came home and I remember laying in bed a couple nights later. And I told my wife about what happened. And I said, explain the whole situation, how she said this. And never forget, my wife was reading and she looked over and she goes, she doesn't know who you are. Your spouse always has a way of keeping you humble. And she said, but if you feel so inclined, why don't you reach out and see if she was asking about you? But just know, I'm never moving to California. That was the discussion that evening. And so the next day I reached out and said, hey, Leanne, it was great. Thank you for your time. It was great to meet you. You said something at the end of the meeting, and I said, I know you probably weren't directing it toward me, but I just want to confirm. And by the way, if you didn't, just delete my email and pretend I never reached out to you because I wouldn't want P&G to find out. And I hit it, sent it. I was like, oh, should I have done that? 20 minutes later, she reaches back out and says, yes, in fact, I was talking to you and I would like to talk to you further. And do you have time for a call? And so that began a dance that lasted 3 or 4 months before I decided to make the move, which was excruciating for me because, like I said, I was on the short list at P&G. We love Cincinnati. I always said my family was content there. We were growing. We were built into the community. Everything we loved was there, including our families. But we felt led to come to California to Google, and it was transformational. And I could talk an hour about this, but that's how I ended up at Google.
Incredible. And was Scott allowed to bring any P&G execs to Google in the future?
You know, it was funny when I told the company I was leaving at the time, there's a guy named A.G. Lafley who was the CEO of P&G, and A.G. brought me to Asia in 1997, promoted me and brought me over to Korea in 1997. I was there for 6 years in Japan and Korea combined. And I remember when I told he's like, how did you meet the Google people? And I said, oh, listen, Scott brought me and the leadership team out to the Valley. He's like, well, we'll never do that again. And so he was joking because, it was good for the company that I ended up at Google because we were friendly to them and we helped them through their digital transformation. So it all worked out in the end. But yeah, Scott and I to this day still keep in touch. I used to get together with him every quarter. He was a great mentor in the Valley for me when I was here. So, you never know how the strangest connections can lead you to places that you could not have anticipated.
Fantastic. Well, at least there won't be a tour to the recruiters or anyone in HR next time someone goes out there. Let's talk about your time actually in Asia, but that was particularly fascinating. For folks who have not worked in Asia, can you share more about the experience you had over there and what your recommendations would be as people develop in their own careers?
So it was and I was, my life story boiled down into 30 seconds. I grew up as a poor Midwestern kid in the Midwestern part of the United States. When I graduated from college, I'd never been west of Chicago and I'd never been east of New York. That was my entire world. And I was the first kid in my family to ever go to college. And if someone would have told me I would have spent 6 years of my life in Asia, I would have laughed at them. But when the company came to me and said, this is the fastest growing part of the world, it's where we're developing our key leaders. We want you to go over there. It was, I was 30 years old. I was 30 years old. And we had two kids who were 4 and 1 at the time. And, my wife and I were Midwestern kids. And I mean, it was the most transformational experience personally and professionally I could have imagined. We went in 1997. I'm looking at many of your faces. You were probably too young to remember this, but at the time in 1996, the Thai baht collapsed and it caused what was called the Asian contagion, and the currencies across the region crumbled. And I happened to arrive in Korea in June of 1997, and the Korean won was about 1,040 to the US dollar. By Christmas, it was 2,000. So it dropped by 70%. I mean, it was a precipitous decline. It just was a calamity for the country, for the business. But I learned more in that condensed time period in that first year than I'd learned probably in the entire first 7 years I spent with the company. So it changed me professionally. It changed us personally. I think I was ultimately a better dad, a better husband, and a better leader because of the experience. So my encouragement to anyone who will listen, except my children, is go. I'm only kidding. We were just talking about this the other day because we have four. Our oldest is 31, our youngest is 19, and we always joke that, I mean, we had the most amazing experience, but we don't want our kids living abroad because it'll be harder to see them. So we know how our parents felt when we went over for that long. But I'm only kidding, because if they wanted to go, I would highly encourage them to go. But it will change you to your core. And the one thing we take away from that experience is people would always say, what's better? Did you like Korea or Japan better? Or what was better than the US? And we learned to say it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. And I think everybody in the world should have the opportunity to live abroad. I would guarantee fewer wars, fewer misunderstandings between cultures, because when you're a part of a culture, you understand it so much better and you realize we share 99.9% of our DNA. We're way more alike than we are different. We may look different, we may have different skin tones, different hairstyles, whatever, but we're at our core human beings. We want something better for our kids than we had for ourselves. We want to enjoy our lives. We want to have a spouse who loves us. We love them. Go down the list of all the things. That's pretty common across any culture. And so it just, opened my eyes to something that, because you grow up in the US, and not disparaging the country I grew up in and love, but we always think we do things better, and we think that everything's invented here, and it's not. There's a lot of great things in the world that we can learn from each other on. So,
Well, thank you for sharing that, Kirk. And let's say for Circana, if you were to send your potential successor overseas one day today, which country would you send them? Would you send them to Lagos, Singapore, Dubai? What are you seeing right now? What is the version of Korea and Japan as of today?
Well, the thing I remember, one of the reasons that the company P&G wanted me to go to Asia was because 80% of babies born in the world were in Asia. So you just do the math, right? If 80% of the babies are being born there, that's where the locus of power is going over the course of centuries. And so I still think Asia is the center of, the growth that the world is going to see. Yes, the US and European economies are big, but they don't grow as fast. The growth is really in Asia. The innovation, the speed at which I remember when I went to Korea in 1997, when I left the US in 1997, my cell phone was bolted to the floor of my car. That was what a cell phone was in 1997 in the US. And you go to Korea, and they called them hand phones. That was the name of phones back in 19 hand phones. And I'm like, it was a hand phone. And so they took me to the phone market, and I carry this phone around everywhere, and it's amazing. I can keep in touch, and it's not this huge block that's bolted to the floor of my car. And so the phone penetration there was off the charts. And I come back to the US, and people are carrying those giant bricks around if they were carrying hand phones. And then, if you look at today, Korea is one of the most e-commerce oriented countries in the world, the highest percent e-commerce penetration in the world. Innovation happens in Asia. It used to be what rolled out in Europe and the US would gravitate there. It's the opposite today. And so, the corner isn't on it. And so I think, the challenge right now with the geopolitical situation in the world, China's a tougher place now. I would, 5 years ago would have said you got to be in China because that's where the world is going to. But with all the geopolitical tensions, that doesn't make as much sense now. Singapore is the natural hub of Asia, but I would say that, countries like Vietnam and which is if you've ever been, it's an incredible, energetic, just vibrant country. It's amazing that the energy there, and a lot of the manufacturing that was in China is moving to Vietnam. It's moving to Indonesia. It's moving to India. So there's a lot of movement to APAC. So that's what I would tell my future successor is, that's where growth will come from. You got to have a strong base in what I call the NATO countries, but you also have to have a planted flag of growth in the fastest growing region.
Amazing. So a friend of mine invited me to Ho Chi Minh City for New Year's Eve. So that was a great move by him. And also, coincidentally, Paul's mom gave me a great tour of Da Nang. So thank you for saying that. Vietnam's the next place to go to. Let's go back to your time at Google versus P&G. But can you also talk about Circana and we want to talk about the culture? What did you bring from P&G? What did you bring from Google? How were they different? And
Mm.
also, what have you brought to the company Circana? Tell us more about the company, actually.
Yeah, so Circana is made up of two companies, actually. We just renamed it a little over a year ago. It was formerly IRI. But actually, it's an alphabet soup. It was IRI, Information Resources Incorporated, and NPD, um, National Purchase Diary. So basically, NPD was all the general merchandise data in the world. So think of sporting goods, apparel, footwear, on the general merchandise side, and IRI had all of the CPG data in the world. So the way to think about IRI is you probably heard of Nielsen, and Nielsen was the main competitor for retail data to IRI. Today, Circana has about a 70 share of the CPG market in the US. So we're far and away the leader in the US of retail data. So what we do is we consolidate all the retail data, and then we use machine learning and artificial intelligence to allow manufacturers to see where their market shares are. So we have point of sale data, we have panel data, which allows you to not only know think of point of sale data is your market shares, what your brands are doing, are categories growing, are there regions which are better than others. Panel data gives you the what, the why, and the who. Why is my market share growing or declining? Who is buying my product and why? And a number of things in between that. We're closing in on $3 billion in revenue. We have about 8,000 people around the world, and we've had a great run. We merged with NPD in August of 20. I joined the company in May of 2021. We merged with NPD in the fall of 22, August of 22, summer, I guess. And so we are now a year and a half post that merger. We renamed the company about a year ago. So that's what we do. And the interesting thing about that data is a lot of times you look at that and think, oh, the middleman always gets crushed. But what enables us to have tailwind is because we are the consolidator of the data. No one, so you could say, well, Walmart can sell their data directly to the manufacturers. They probably could if that was a business they wanted to be in, but they don't really want to be in that business. What they want to be in the business of is selling stuff. And so we allow them to continue to focus on their core, but then we give them a look at the total market. So we consolidate all the retail data. So Walmart knows their share because of the data that we consolidate with all the other retailers around the world. On the manufacturer side, the same thing. They could buy the data individually from retailers, but then they would have a mismatch of all the data, and they would have to do all of the market projections where they have holes in the data, and it just doesn't work. It's not their core competency. So it's a great business to be in because when the markets are hot and you want to spend more, you want to know what's working, so you spend more. When the markets are soft and you want to know how to drive every single dollar that you're spending, they want to spend more on data. So it's been a great business to be in, and it's one that I grew up in because at P&G, IRI was my first data provider. And so I've known that industry and those companies, and it was a great mix for me of CPG heritage and technology with Google, that this data and technology and insights industry kind of was a natural merging of those. So the other question was, you said, what's the difference between, did you want me to answer that,
Yep.
P&G and
Yep. Procter
Google?
Gamble and Google,
Yeah.
and then the
So it's
what
interesting when I'll tell you my first year at Google was awful. And I mean that sincerely. And I'll talk more about that later because I know you were going to ask me a question. When I say awful, it's because I was brought in to do something that Nikesh Arora, if any of you remember Nikesh, who was the chief business officer at the time, Nikesh said, look, Kirk, the corporate antibodies are going to come out when you come in because everybody's going to say, oh yeah, we can do this. We're all brand building experts. We don't need somebody to help us do this. We don't need people out of our organization into another organization. We can handle it. And he's going to say, we're going to blow right through that. But there was a lot of corporate antibodies because people were like, yeah, I don't want to give you people from my org. I don't want you to own relationships with these big global advertisers because those are marquee clients in my markets. And I don't want that to happen. Believe it or not, there was a lot of fiefdoms at Google. I know that's a shock to everyone because nobody ever knows that that feels like that. I'm being facetious and sarcastic, but um, the the interesting thing. So if I stepped back and I said this, my first year and a half in. By the way, it got way better after that first year, and you if any of you run or you lift weights, like you got to have a little pain before you get gain. And so similarly, I think if you walked into a new company and it was easy, there's something wrong because you have to experience some pain to be able to grow, I believe. But some differences between P&G and Google. Google is a principle-based culture. If you think about do no evil, like what does that mean really? What does it mean not to be evil? Everybody has a different interpretation of that. Or what does googly mean? I remember asking people that, and everybody had a different answer. I'm like, well, how the heck do we run this place if like we can't even define what being googly means, or what does it mean not to be evil? Because what's evil to one person is, always say is like one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Like how do you really define these things? And so at P&G, the culture was very rule based. I mean, there were rules and like here's what you do, here's what you don't do. So it was very, very small control limits. And they tried to keep people in check. And they've been around 175 years, whereas Google was much more about principles. So principles versus rules. The other thing that was very different between the cultures is P&G was a culture of general managers. You grew up to be the one throat to choke. Like where when you become a general manager, you are the decision maker. You own the good and the bad. Like there is only one person who owns that. When I came to Google, I remember asking like, who owns the decision on this? People are like, I'm not sure. I don't know. Like, what do you mean? This is a big decision. I don't know. We get in a room, we talk about it, we figure it out. I'm like, really? I don't even know how that works. Like, I'm not sure I understand that. And miraculously it works. But I would tell you the generalist notion at a Procter versus the specialist focus at Google is really interesting. Because Google goes very deep and narrow. P&G was very broad and shallow, just very different business models, which leads to a different culture. The other thing, though, that was really different about the two companies, P&G was a leadership machine every year, if you ever read like the Fortune top leadership academies in the corporate world, P&G for 30 plus years has generally been number one or number two. Because from the day you walk in, it's a very intentional leadership development organization. They groom you to lead. You know, Shakespeare said, but you wouldn't get a shake that didn't think it was on your bingo card today to get a Shakespeare quote, but Shakespeare said, and this is in the 1500s, so excuse the words, but he said, some men are born great, others become great, and yet others are thrust into greatness. And he could have said men and women, but he just said men. So I'll add women into that because women are sometimes in a lot of cases even better than men as leaders. And I think, you know, that is the case that P&G followed for leadership development. And interestingly, when I got to Google, I'm like, well, what are we doing about leadership development? Like, how do we build into leaders? And we had sporadic things, but never the systemic building in intentional leadership development that we had at P&G. So just a very different thing. You could argue, you could make the argument on paper very easily. Google's been far more successful in a shorter time than P&G has been over, you know, 175 years. But nonetheless, part of sustainability is you develop a bench, right? You develop skills and capabilities that you grow into over time, and you develop your leaders from internally, which was very, again, very different between the companies. And then the last thing I would say, the differences between the cultures, P&G was a consumer-led company. Like the phrase when I was there was consumer is boss. So everything we did as a marketer, everything we did as a product development organization, everything we did as a selling organization was starting with what is the need? And not just what the articulated need is, but what is the unarticulated need? What are the connect the dots? You know, Steve Jobs famously said, if I sat down at a focus group and asked a consumer to tell me what they need, they would never be able to articulate that because they couldn't tell me, you know, this thing I'm carrying in my pocket, can you make it the best phone ever? But at the same time, can you make it the best camera ever? Can you make it the best connector to the internet ever? Can you give me all of my music on there? Can you add a video recorder on there that's better than a camcorder that I could be like, again, no consumer would have articulated. And by the way, can you make it small enough and more powerful than a supercomputer? No one would have ever said that, but he had that vision based on what consumers' unarticulated needs are. At Google, I would say it was more engineering led. It was like, let's build something. We may or may not talk to customers and consumers. We'll test a lot of it, but you know, I can remember being so frustrated with the product teams. They would make these announcements without consulting GVO and say, "Hey, we're gonna deprecate this product that, by the way, agencies spend like $30 billion a year with us on, and we're just going to deprecate them." It's like, whoa, what the backup? Like, what do you mean? We just announced that we're, and I get these angry calls and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you guys just announced you're deprecating. How dare you? I'd be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. What do you mean deprecate? Like, what are we deprecating? And I wouldn't even know. And it's just the kind of thing that very different. Like we'd say, you know, we're going to test and we're going to iterate, but it was more engineering led than consumer led. But those are just differences, which I think. And the other thing I would say is the P&G was like um, it was like a painting that was very contiguous. You know, it was like someone started and said, all right, I'm gonna have this, you know, nature background and with people in it. It was very intentional and purposeful. Google was like, I described it as a patchwork quilt, right? So every person that comes into the organization is a different patch on that quilt. And individually, everybody might not fit together, but collectively it makes this beautiful culture and just a very different way of getting to the same place. So that's what I would say the differences are, you know, between them. And I'm so thankful I had those differences. Not everybody gets the chance to work at two, you know, values. The other thing I tell people, which I've really tried to bring to Circana, is values are the most important underpinning of an organization. Those values are things that are immutable, that you stand for, that if you woke up at 3 in the morning and said 5 things that we do, we're never gonna bend on are these. And as long as you have values, your culture is built on top of that. Without values, they crumble. You know, if you look at companies that cheat to get where they are, eventually the culture crumbles because you're cheating to get where you are. Cultures that fight, that are, you know, that are not about lifting each other up but tearing each other down, eventually they crumble. You know, if their values aren't about helping each other grow. So I think, you know, for me, the values of the companies were very similar. The execution of the culture was different, but effective. And so I'm just thankful that I had the opportunity to see both of those.
We'll go back to the values in a bit, but I want to pull out something further. You mentioned about the leadership that Procter and Gamble really put in you. But there was a great story that you shared previously, that you almost left Procter and Gamble before joining Google.
Hmm.
And there was an executive that came to you and talked about persuading you to stay. Can you share more
Mm.
about that? And I think a lot of us could actually learn from that situation. We're all in a tough jobs, tough
Mm.
situations. Some of us choose to leave. And
Yeah.
how did you really think about not leaving for the other opportunity?
Yeah. Hmm. Interesting. Great question. Man, you do your homework. Gosh, that's fantastic that you know that. But I said, oh my gosh, I've never had anybody do such great homework on me. It's almost scary. But so in 1996, I was at P&G. I was a brand manager doing really well, but I was terribly frustrated. I was in the straw that broke the camel's back was I came in on a Saturday. My wife would work on Saturdays. She was a hair and makeup artist, and I'd bring my girls with me to work. And they were at the time, I don't know, they would make them three and a baby at the time. And so I remember going in on a Saturday and I've got like a pumpkin seat carrying my baby and holding my other daughter's hand. And I go through and I badge in, it's Saturday, badge in, and I'm getting ready to go to the elevator. And like the voice of God comes with the intercom. Excuse me, you need to check in your guests at the security center. It's like, oh, okay, my 3-year-old and baby, I'll check them in at security. So, because I'm sure they're going to steal corporate secrets on the Pepto-Bismol brand that I was running at the time. So I walk in and I check in, and the guy's like, "You don't have um, clearance to be able to bring anybody in the building on a weekend." And I was like, "What?" So I had to call my division president on a Saturday to get in because I was preparing for him for a board meeting on Tuesday. So I had to come in to do it. He's like, "Why are you calling me on a Saturday?" I'm like, "Well, I'd prefer not to, but for some reason I don't have clearance, even though I run a, $500 million brand, but can I get into the building?" So he gave me, and I was like, this is it. Like if a company doesn't trust somebody they're entrusting with $500 million worth of sales to come in, and that's one of the things, by the way, that Google was exceptional about was trusting people. P&G did, that's where the rule versus principle cultures came in. P&G tried to keep you from yourself, whereas Google tries to let you make mistakes so you can grow. But neither here nor there. So 2 days later, I get a call from a headhunter saying, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you about a job. And this job is VP of marketing for Coors Brewing in Golden, Colorado." They would have called me 6 months earlier, I'd been like, no chance. I'm not market. I mean, I like beer, but I'm not going to market beer. But they caught me at the right time. And so I said, all right, I'll talk to you. And, we were young family and, we just getting started. And I thought, man, if we're going to go, this is the time to go. So I went through the interview process. Peter Coors of the founding Coors family makes me the offer as the VP of marketing. How old am I at the time? I'm like 29 years old. And we're going to live in Golden, Colorado. It's beer, it's sports marketing, living in the mountains. Life is great. And so I said yes. And I remember, I was in a airport. I was in the Dallas airport, and they'd made me the offer, and I was connecting as a P&G trip, and called my wife, and she said, "Well, we're young. We can take a risk, and if it doesn't work out, we can always come back home." So I said, "All right, we're going to do it." So I called them and said yes. So 2 days later, I told P&G that I was going to be leaving, and my direct boss at the time starts crying. "You can't leave. You're from Cincinnati. What are we going to tell the organization that a local is leaving? You could run this company one day." I'm like, "I'm leaving," and I gave her my laundry list of grievances. And then, of course, the next day, my general manager, who's your big boss, takes me down. He said, I go through my grievances. He said, "So, advice for you," and I carry this advice to this day. He said, "When you leave, you should always be running to something, not running from something." And he was like, that was a gut punch. I was like, "Ooh, I am running from something versus to something." And the second thing he told me, he's like, real leaders, when there's problems, stay and fix them versus run from them. So I'm disappointed because I thought you were one of the most genuine real leaders. And so kind of challenged my manhood. So I went home that night, man. I tossed and turned all night and made one of the hardest calls I've ever made that next morning because I had told Coors that I was coming and I had to call them. And I had even had a conference call with the entire marketing organization a couple days before this. And I had to call them back and say, I'm not coming. And boy, they called me everything but by my name. And because they had told all the other candidates after this 3-month search that they'd found their person and they were now, can you imagine getting a call after that saying, oh, we're just kidding. We'd like to have you come back in. So it was, and another valuable lesson I learned at that time, which is consistent with my faith, is let your yes be your yes and your no be your no. And I let P&G talk me into staying. But I shouldn't have said yes before I really thought it through in the first place. And so when I decided to leave Procter and Gamble, I really, really, Nikesh was so emphatic that I signed my employment agreement the day I accepted, which was early September of 2013. But I said, Nikesh, and I was a senior leader at P&G. I was an officer of the company, and if I told them I was leaving and they decided just to tell me to leave, I'd lose all the equity that I had vested. And I told Nikesh, I said, hey, here's my promise to you. I'm not doing that because I want to be able to tell the company, I want to be able to be principled and tell the company and look them in the eye that I haven't officially accepted yet till I tell them I'm leaving. And I want to be able to do that. I just want to be a man of my word because I made this mistake once. I told Nikesh the story about Coors. And I said, the other thing I want to be able to do is, I want you to know that I've learned a lesson, and I promise you, Nikesh, that my yes is my yes and my no is my no. And so when I told P&G at the end of October, which was like 2 months later, and you talk about a crazy time, I had to keep it in for 2 months, not even telling our kids, because you tell 4 kids that you're moving and somebody's going to leak. And I couldn't fire my kids, so I couldn't tell them. So I held it in for 2 months. And then when I told the company, it was one of the hardest days because AG was my CEO at the time. And he was like, you're going to the Wild West. They're going to drive you crazy. They're not as disciplined as you. And I just said, AG, my yes is my yes, my no is my no. And I told them I was coming, I'm coming. And it was a hard decision, like leaving your family, because I grew up there and it was a promote from within company. But one of the best decisions I ever made was coming to Google because I met a lot of you and got to lead an incredible group of people and, really expand who I was as a leader. And Google was no walk in the park, like I told you that first year. And there were a lot of times that first year I wanted to walk. But again, what I learned was I told at the time a couple of people, I'm like, they're gonna have to carry me out of here. I'm not leaving. So they're gonna have to fire me because I'm gonna make this thing work. And because we had a great organization and we were able to make it work. But it wasn't easy. And again, it was just an opportunity to grow. And I think in our careers, the times the times we grow the most are not in times of success, but in times of challenge, right? That's when you grow the most because if you don't have, a diamond, it does not start out a diamond. A diamond starts out as what? Coal. Only through pressure does a piece of coal become a diamond. And I think all of us from a career standpoint, you need pressure. You need those challenges that are not up and to the right all the time. And I remember distinctly, and those of you who worked in my organization, I talked about this quite often, is Google will not go up and to the right forever. And we need resilient people who are going to be able to weather the sideways movements and those challenges. And we all know what happened last year when Google unceremoniously laid people off, which was not the way that I think the culture was intended and set up to be. But nonetheless, it was what it was, and people unfortunately were laid off, and maybe some of you were, which is horrible and tough. One of the toughest things as a leader I've ever had to do is to let people go. I don't care how challenged a person was in their role. When you look across and you see a human being and look them in the eye and tell them that you're going to have to let them go and they're going to have to do something else, there's no harder thing in the world if people have a soul and a pulse that they have to do is to let someone go. Because those people behind that badge have families and dreams and bills and obligations and to not and to have to let them go is a tough should be the toughest thing we do as leaders. So that was a long-winded answer
No, it's
to
a
a
great
great question,
answer,
but
Kirk. Thank you. So let's keep on this path of hard things to do and what you've had to do. Uh, it's public news. You really put it out in other podcasts that you had cancer, stage 4 cancer at the end of your
Mm,
first year. There's a lot of people going through a lot of tough times right now with the economy, finding jobs.
mm.
How should they go about their day when they can't find any jobs, especially at the Google salary level, and they have bills to pay? And what suggestions do you have for them? And how should we actually tackle these tough times?
Yeah. So I've had we all have challenges in our life. Mine were no harder than challenges. And I know in particular, one of you has dealt with some very significant cancer issues as well. So, um, for me, I would tell you that the time, I believe we all have a choice. Are we going to be a victor or a victim? And it's a pretty simple decision. Like, how do we go about it? Do we look at our challenges as opportunities, or do we look at our challenges as an end of the road? And I choose to be a victor. And that might not mean in my time and in my way, but the analogy I'll give is I've coached youth sports for over 20 years. I taught or coached all different types of sports. My favorite sport to coach was American football. And one of the core things that you teach, and I taught them as young as kindergarten, which is the funniest thing to teach 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds American football, because you can imagine with the equipment weighs more than they do. And like they were like bobbleheads. But one of the first things you teach kids who are blocking, call them offensive linemen, is you want to stay low and you want to get out first, right? You want to be on the balls of your feet and you want to get out first and stay low because your natural inclination is to stand up. And when you're flat-footed and you stand up and you get hit, what happens? You get knocked down. And so for me, that's a great metaphor for how I approach challenges is I'm staying low and I'm aggressive. I want to be action oriented. I want to be moving forward and I will make acts of errors of commission, meaning I'm doing something versus errors of omission, meaning I'm just not going to go forward. And I think a lot of times people freeze in the headlights, right? The deer in the headlights analogy. When things are tough, I remember being in South Korea. I've never experienced anything like a currency collapse. And some of you who have worked in regions where that occurs, it was like nothing I've ever experienced in my career. I mean, I could talk for hours about some of the things we had to do to get through that, but we just had to act like we had to borrow money from the German subsidiary of Procter and Gamble to make payroll. We were bartering Pringles we went from not barely getting Pringles in on the store shelf because it was moving so quickly to overnight having 3 years worth of inventory. We had to like barter and sell our Pringles to other PNG countries around the world, and we had to use currency translation to be able to offset the translation. I mean, it was crazy. Just had to do it, right? You had to survive. You had to figure out how to keep moving forward. And I think, one of the things that I believe, a couple principles I try to use is one is bring people onto your journey with you. Bring people onto your journey with you. Like, don't go solo. The world kind of says, oh, at least the American world says, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, figure it out on your own. I think the opposite, have a pack, have a group, have people that you lean into and share. Example I'll give you is when I found out I had cancer, I remember at the time Omid Kordestani had taken over for Nikesh for a period of 7 or 8 months. And I remember telling Omid what was going on. And I said, hey, I'm going to send a video out. I used to do these video updates for the organization frequently. And I told Omid, I'm going to send a video out and share with the org what I'm going through. And he's like, oh, I think that's a terrible idea. I'm like, oh, terrible idea. Wow. Okay. Why do you think it's serious? He goes, it's personal. It'll cause the organization more angst than it'll help. I really, it's up to you, but I don't think I'd do that. And HR also said they don't think I should do that either. And I'm like, yeah, okay, thanks for the advice, but it's who I am. I believe in sharing and, letting people know what's going on. So I did this video and I said basically two things. One is, this is what's going on. And if you could do one thing for me, it's focus on the business. That would be amazing because it's one less thing I have to worry about. So the second thing, if you're so inclined, is prayer would be great because I believe in that. And that would be awesome if you wouldn't mind doing that for me. And so that was my message. It's 5 minutes long, and I don't know if any of you remember getting that, but I sent it out. It was a Tuesday night. I'll never forget it. In March of 2015, and I remember coming into the office the next morning. My assistant at the time, Amy Sujishi, Amy's like, "You are not going to believe this. You have like 500 emails that came in last night, overnight. People," and she goes, "I put them in a folder and I sat and looked at my emails. I was super productive that day for like 4 hours reading all of these emails. People shared with me the most unbelievable things you can imagine because I shared with them. I brought them onto my journey and brought them into what was going on. And I have never felt more supported and encouraged and prayed for and loved on, honestly, like the amount of outpouring from the organization. And to this day, I still hear from people about that. And they'll say, "Hey, you remember that, when you sent that video out or what you said, I still think about that." So this is one is bring people along with you. The second thing is, and I know we want to open it up for questions. The second thing that I would tell you is, never give up hope. I remember when I got the, initial diagnosis, it was stage 2. And then by the time post-surgery, before I got treatment, it had progressed to stage 4 in just no time. And I remember after I had my treatment and my wife and I were talking one night, I just said, "Man, I don't know how this is gonna end up, but I'm not gonna give up. I'm not gonna quit." I've had if God takes me back at the end of this sooner than I hope, it's okay. I've had an amazing life. So I'm living in hope, not living in fear. And I'm gonna keep going forward. And I think a lot of times when you get caught up, it's easy to, because I did, you're like, "Man, I feel sorry for myself. I don't want to share with people that I'm down, that I'm bummed, that, because I think people rally around you and they make connections for you, they help you." And the other thing is, by sharing and not giving up hope, you really allow yourself to dream and to see something different going forward. I think sometimes the greatest gifts are the unintended benefits of your greatest challenges. They really are. And I've seen my own daughter, my oldest daughter had stage 3 kidney cancer, which changed my life as well. But anyway, all those things, I think for me, when things are tough, when you're going through challenges, those are the things that I used to, or at least I've learned to rely on when business or personal situations feel overwhelming in the moment.
The prayers you asked for worked, Kirk.
What's that?
The prayers that you asked for worked.
They certainly did. They certainly did.
One more thing I want to ask to make sure you cover is you had mentioned the job to help you achieve, your job is to help people achieve their dreams. How did you
Mm.
realize that was the right thing to do and putting that as your leadership mantra?
So I believe what we do at work is what we do at work. It's not who we are. Part of who we are. Like we all want a noble purpose, right? Selling selling more diapers at P&G was not a noble purpose. Selling more digital ads at Google was not a noble purpose. Data and analytics, which is amazing, is not a noble purpose. And I wanted to have a noble purpose. And that noble purpose to me was I found myself like, and I think I've had a 35-year career. And I remember, I can tell you probably with 90% accuracy back to when I started of my closest teams that I worked with, names, number of kids, they've changed over the years. Maybe we've lost touch, but at the time I could tell you that. I could tell you people I've promoted. I can tell you people that I've recommended for MBA programs and written recos for them. I could tell you people that I've had to let go. I could tell you, all these things about people I could tell you, but I couldn't tell you 1 year at Google what my revenue was any 1 year. I could tell you that I hit my revenue targets, but I couldn't tell you what that revenue was, which leads me to believe that our job is about the human beings we interact with than it is about, the things we do at work. I mean, we have to do those things at work. We have to deliver what the company expects us to, because that's how we stay gainfully employed. But there's a bigger purpose in lifting each other up and helping each other climb and helping and enable people to achieve their personal and professional ambitions and dreams. And so for me, that's what my noble purpose is being able to help people achieve those things and being, like Misty, somebody mentioned Misty Davis. Misty Davis is my CMO. Misty, if many of you know her, I used to affectionately call her the mayor of Google. Misty was a 16-year Googler who was a seller who had zero marketing experience. And when I called Misty about being my CMO, she's like, I don't have any marketing experience. I'm like, yes, you do. You've worked with the best and biggest marketers in the world. You have as much marketing savvy as anybody I know. You just haven't had the traditional upbringing in it. And I'll help you. I'll help you achieve that. And Misty has, so I tell you, her first year, she walked in on February 1. We on April 1st announced we were being acquired. And then on August 1, we merged with another company. And then a year from the merger, we renamed the company. Do you know how many CMOs ever rename a company? Like I can count on one hand. And she did an amazing job. Like everything that I knew she could do, she did. She just needs somebody to believe in her, somebody to give her a hand up and give her a shot. And I think, I helped her achieve, and we progressed her career 5 to 7 years with this move. She can go anywhere. She's got a CMO. She's in the C-suite. She has connections now that she didn't always have, and she's showcasing her talents, and she's tapped into something that she knew she wanted to do, but she couldn't necessarily get to on her own. She needed help. So anyway, that's how I found my noble purpose, and everybody has their own version of their noble purpose, but I would encourage you to figure out what that is, because it'll make what you do every day not just about selling more digital stuff or placing people or whatever it is you do now post Google, but it will give you a purpose greater than yourself. And at least for me, if I had to think about myself all day, I would puke. I mean, I don't want to think about me. I want, and because I'm naturally selfish, and I think if I can put the focus on other people, one of the things when I ran my first marathon, I was asking people for tips, and someone said to me, write your, because you wear a timing bracelet where each mile you have your time splits that you want to be on. And next to each one of those time splits, I put a person's name. And for that mile, I would pray for that person the whole time. So it made me think of 26 people that I intentionally wanted to spend about 7 minutes and 25 seconds on the whole time, because it took the focus off of me and it put the focus on them. And I'll tell you what, it was like, if any of you ever run a marathon, it is a mind scramble, because your mind like is fading out. Like your body basically at mile 20 says, screw you, I'm quitting. But then your mind has to take over and power your body through it. And so if your mind is focused on you and all the pain, you're gonna walk, you're gonna stop. But if it's focused on something else, somebody else, and that's when I started learning, when I started thinking about like, hey, if I focus on other people and not myself, my day is a whole lot better. When I start focusing on me, it's a painful day. Because I'm selfish by nature, and it just helps me be better.
I'm sure we'll all disagree that you're selfish based on what you just shared today. But let's go to the questions. Dwight, why don't you go for it? If you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Kirk. Hi, Chris. Thanks for having this session. I was actually on the DVIP team, so I never got to work with you directly, but the GCAS as finance folks always had great things to say about you. I see why. The vulnerability has been great, and that positivity is really contagious. My question is kind of two-part. I was waiting with bated breath there when you were talking about the consensus-driven versus maybe more leadership and decisive kind of cultures, and which works best in practice. Obviously, it's context dependent, but maybe after your time there and you're at neither P&G or Google, what's your opinion on both approaches now, and what have you brought to Circana?
Yeah, that is a great question. So it is context dependent. I would tell you there is magic to the Google consensus. I remember thinking this is going to break. I don't know how this works. I mean, how is it that like the only natural place where everything comes together is Sundar? Like you really think about it, you think about the PALs and GBO in the mix. The only place all the things come together is Sundar. Like I'm thinking it's a $300 billion company is going to break. But the magic of the culture allows it to work. It's frustratingly slow. And I think the Achilles heel of the company at some point will be it'll get so big and it'll start to grind slower because you've got to be able to make decisions quicker and be more nimble. And somebody's got to take a courageous call sometimes and live with that. And part of the challenge of a consensus culture is you can't ever go back and say, all right, who made the call and what can we learn from this and what do we do differently going forward? But I also believe that, the general manager, like one throat to choke, while powerful, also has its shortcomings because no one person, the danger in that system is the person who is the general manager. Um, it's person dependent because what I was trained to be a general manager is you have to be the expert in one thing, and in my case, it was a marketing expertise. But I had to know the second most about every other function to be able to ask the right questions of my leaders. I heard something the other day about John F. Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs. And one of the reasons the U.S. that was the invasion of Cuba that failed. The U.S. should have easily rolled over Cuba, but they didn't. Why was that? Because what happened is John Kennedy took each individual person in his cabinet and asked them their opinion. And individually, those people came to him and said, oh, this is what you should do. And so he listened, and everybody did it individually. And then he would make a decision. But the problem was he didn't have the best information because I find as a general manager, having everybody around the table and being able to say, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And having their opinions in the air and letting people then challenge their opinions. As a leader, I love hearing people debate an idea because then it allows me to think more deeply about it versus an individual one-on-one, because I don't know always how to ask the right questions, but other people may ask questions in ways that I can't. And so that allows me to make better decisions. So there's shortcomings if another person doesn't do it in the same way and does the John Kennedy method, maybe they don't make the similar decisions that I would, or maybe they make better decisions. I don't know. So I think there's challenges with both, but ultimately, I think either can work. It's culture dependent, but I err on the side of general manager. And Philip and I worked very closely over the last couple of years trying to find people more like my heritage who had more general manager experience, who could be, Alan Tigason, if any of you knew Alan and had a chance to work in America's LCS for Alan, he was very much a general. He's now the CEO of DocuSign, but he had very much that skill set of being a general manager and the capabilities of being able to make that decision and also live in a consensus driven world. So it's a great question, Dwight, and I hope I didn't drive you too crazy on the DVIP stuff back in the day.
No, you did, but it was a great learning experience. Thank you.
So we're at the top of the hour already, Kirk. Just one more question from me is, how can the Xoogler community be helpful to you? But also please share about, are you recruiting right now? Do you have jobs available, but people who are job hunting should try to apply for Circana?
Man, always looking for great people. I'm a believer, to give another analogy, you hire talent, you don't hire jobs. I used to drive HR insane because I would design organizations around people, not, because the traditional HR methodology is you build out org charts first and you put names in boxes later. Like that's the traditional HR develop your org. I, on the other hand, would use the basketball analogy. If I have two 7-footers on my basketball team, I'm not going to play a fast break up and down the court game. I'm going to play a half court, plotting, crushing defense with two tall rim blockers and make the other team beat me from the outside. That's how I play that. If I had 4 guards, I would have a fast break, run the court, run the other team into the ground team. But it would be dependent on what athletes I had on my team, the kind of strategy I would use. And so I believe hiring the best talent is way more important than hiring like Misty. I just gave you that example of Misty. I hired Amy Morentic. Amy Morentic was, if any of you know Amy, she led the auto pod for GCAS, all the auto clients globally. And I hired Amy to be my solutions leader, which is media, strategic analytics, and growth consulting, which is like a consulting firm within our firm. She didn't have experience in 2 of those 3 areas, but again, she grew into it. She was just great talent. I wanted to get her on the team. And we've hired several Googlers on my team. We probably have 8 or 9 already on the team, and we're here and we're going. So I'm very willing. Reach out. Happy to hear from any of you.
And the last thing, can the Xoogler community do anything for you besides referring some great talent to you?
I'd love to just stay connected. I mean, it's such an honor to see many of you, and Google is such a incredible culture. The bright, I used to say, I tell people at P&G this openly. P&G used to brag like, we have more PhDs on staff than any other CPG company. And I remember David Taylor, who's the previous CEO who just recently retired. I remember I had lunch with David. I was at Google a couple of years, and I said, David, I hate to tell you this. Google is by far the most intellectually curious and intense company in the world. So quit acting like you guys have the corner on intelligence. Like, but not only smart, but just super, super high EQs. That's what I love about Googlers is there's just such a magic combination. One of the things I learned at Google is like to lighten up, to have more fun at work. Like the Google culture is just this curious mix of intellectual firepower and not taking yourself too seriously. Like that's an amazing combo. And that's one of the things we've tried to bring to Circana is that mix. Don't want to, and we've changed the culture a lot already, but still a long way to go. So just staying in touch would be a gift to me. So it's great seeing many of you. It was an honor to join you and share some of my my mistakes. And hopefully you won't make the same ones I did. But it's been a real honor to see you all.
Thank you for inspiring all of us, Kirk. What wonderful feedback and suggestions and leadership advice for all of us. And thank you again, and we look forward to inviting you back again soon. Congrats
I
again.
love that. Thank you all. Take
Thanks
care.
everyone for joining.
Thank you.